she hasn't sailed anywhere in almost 60 years. She's permanently welded to a pier in Long Beach, California, half museum, half hotel, and completely unable to move. And yet, more people report seeing something move aboard the Queen Mary than on almost any other haunted location in America. A little girl who drowned in a pool that's been empty for decades, still splashing. A crewman crushed behind a steel door in 1966, still walking the engine room, still looking for the wrench he never found. A hotel room so notorious, the ship stopped renting it out for 30 years, then turned it into a paranormal attraction and started charging a premium for the privilege of spending the night. Time magazine has called her one of the most haunted places on Earth. Paranormal investigators have logged well over 100 distinct spirits. And unlike most haunted houses, this one has something almost no other haunted location can claim: a body count you can actually document in naval records, in newspaper clippings, in coroner's reports. This is the story of the RMS Queen Mary, and why so many people believe that when she finally stopped sailing, something on board decided to stay. To understand why the Queen Mary is so haunted, you first have to understand how enormous her life was. This wasn't some small fishing boat with one tragic local legend attached to it. This was, for a time, the largest and fastest ocean liner on the planet. A ship that carried royalty, movie stars, and eventually an entire war effort. She was built on the River Clyde in Scotland at the John Brown & Company shipyard and launched on September 26, 1936 by Cunard Line. At just over 1,000 feet long and weighing more than 81,000 tons, she was a floating city. Over 2,000 passengers and roughly 1,000 roux at a time, spread across multiple classes of service, from lavish first-class suites with their own private decks to more modest third-class cabins down in the lower decks. The interior was Art Deco to its bones. Polished wood paneling, murals, chrome fixtures, enormous ballrooms. She was designed to be an experience, not just a mode of transport, and for a few golden years in the late 1930s, that's exactly what she was. She held the Blue Riband, the unofficial title for the fastest Atlantic crossing, not once, but multiple times, going head-to-head with her great rival, the French liner Normandie. The passenger list over the years reads like a Hollywood premiere. Winston Churchill crossed on her repeatedly during the war years and later signed part of the D-Day planning documents while aboard. Elizabeth Taylor, Audrey Hepburn, Bing Crosby, Fred Astaire, they all sailed on the Queen Mary at some point in her career. She was, in every sense, glamorous. But glamour is only half the story, because in 1939 everything changed. When Britain entered World War II, the Queen Mary was stripped of her luxury. Her elegant furnishings were removed and put into storage. Her hull was repainted, a dull, matte gray, and she was converted into a troop transport, one of the most important the Allies had. She earned the nickname the Grey Ghost, partly for her camouflage color and partly because of what made her so valuable: speed. The Queen Mary was fast enough to outrun German U-boats. Naval regulations actually forbade her from slowing down or stopping under almost any circumstance, because a stationary ship was a target and losing her, along with everyone she was carrying, would have been catastrophic. On a single crossing, she could carry over 15,000 troops at once, more people than had ever been transported on one vessel in history, a record she still holds. That speed and size made her nearly untouchable by submarines. Adolf Hitler reportedly offered a substantial reward and a decoration to any U-boat commander who could sink her. None ever did. But her greatest danger during the war didn't come from the enemy. It came from her own escort. On October 2, 1942, the Queen Mary was roughly 20 miles off the coast of County Donegal, Ireland, carrying an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 American troops of the 29th Infantry Division towards Scotland. For the final leg of the journey through dangerous waters, she was joined by an escort, the HMS Curacoa, a much smaller, older light cruiser built during the First World War, tasked with anti-aircraft defense. The two ships were sailing a zigzag pattern designed to make it nearly impossible for a U-boat to line up a torpedo shot. The Queen Mary was moving at close to 29 knots, enormous speed for a ship her size, while the Curacoa struggled along at her own top speed, trying to keep pace. And then, on a clear afternoon, the two zigzag patterns intersected in the worst possible way. Accounts from survivors describe the horror unfolding in slow motion. A seaman aboard the Curacoa, watching the Queen Mary's bow, realized with growing dread that instead of passing safely, the massive liner was swinging directly toward them. He reportedly shouted a warning, but by then it was already too late. The gap had closed to almost nothing, and there was no time left to react. Aboard the Queen Mary, the officers on the bridge believed the smaller, more maneuverable Curacoa would be the one to give way. She didn't, or couldn't, in time. The collision that followed was catastrophic. The Queen Mary's bow sliced clean through the Curacoa's hull, cutting the cruiser almost completely in half. Witnesses described sailors on the smaller ship being thrown into the freezing October water like leaves falling from a tree. Steam roared from the ruptured boiler rooms. Within minutes, the Curacoa's wreckage was gone beneath the waves. And the Queen Mary did not stop. Under strict wartime orders, a fully loaded troop transport was forbidden from halting to attempt a rescue. Stopping would have made her a stationary target for any U-boat in the area, risking thousands of soldiers' lives to save a few dozen sailors already in the water. So she continued on, leaving the Curacoa's survivors behind for other vessels to find. Of the Curacoa's crew of roughly 430 men, only around 99 seamen and 2 officers survived. Well over 300 men died in the water that afternoon, many from hypothermia in the hours before rescue ships arrived. It remains one of the costliest accidental losses of the Second World War for the Royal Navy. Because of wartime secrecy, the full inquiry into what happened wasn't made public until after the war in Europe had ended. Blame was ultimately split between both vessels, but for the men lost that day, the finding changed nothing. To this day, some of those aboard the Queen Mary, staff and paranormal investigators alike, believe that the ship carries an echo of that afternoon. Reports near the bow describe sudden crashing sounds with no source and cold, sudden temperature drops, as though the ship remembers the moment it became, unintentionally, a killer. The Queen Mary continued as a troop ship until 1945, carrying home hundreds of thousands of soldiers, including so-called GI brides, women who had married American servicemen and were being brought to the United States after the war. By the time she was finally restored to civilian service, she had carried well over 800,000 military personnel across the Atlantic. The golden age of the transatlantic liner didn't survive the jet age. By the 1960s, passengers who once spent 5 days crossing the ocean could now fly it in a matter of hours, and ticket sales for ships like the Queen Mary collapsed. In 1967, after 1,001 transatlantic crossings, Cunard retired her for good. The city of Long Beach, California purchased the ship and towed her one final, non-powered voyage around Cape Horn to a permanent mooring, where she was converted into a floating hotel, museum, and event space. She has never sailed again and never will. Her engines were largely gutted for the conversion. But it's during those final years of active service and the decades since she was permanently docked that most of her ghost stories take root. Deep in the lower decks of the Queen Mary, past where most tourists ever go, is a long, narrow corridor known as Shaft Alley, the passage that runs alongside the ship's massive propeller shafts. It is widely considered the single most consistently active location on the entire ship. On July 10, 1966, during the ship's final year of transatlantic service, an 18-year-old crew member named John Petter was working the overnight shift when a routine safety drill began. Watertight doors throughout the lower decks are designed to seal automatically in an emergency, sealing off sections of the hull to prevent flooding from spreading. Petter was reportedly hurrying to get through door 13 in time. He didn't make it. The door closed on him, crushing him against the frame. He was found shortly afterward by a crewmate, still alive but critically injured, and died before he could reach the ship's hospital. In the decades since, staff and tour groups working in and around Shaft Alley have reported an extraordinary volume of consistent activity, far more than almost anywhere else on the ship. Visitors describe seeing a young, bearded man in blue-gray overalls, sometimes appearing to be looking for something, occasionally reported asking guests if they've seen his wrench, the same tool investigators believe Petter may have used trying to force the door open. Witnesses say the figure vanishes the moment they turn toward it directly. Security staff have described sudden knocking on door 13 with no one present, unexplained clanging and machinery sounds in engine spaces that have been powered down for decades, and, in more than one account, greasy handprints appearing on clean surfaces after the area was checked and found empty. One frequently repeated story involves a security guard patrolling with a dog. As the pair approached door 13, the dog reportedly froze, growled at something unseen, and refused to go any further, eventually bolting away from the door entirely, dragging its handler with it. In a separate account, a tour guide leaving the engine room on an escalator turned and saw a man in dark, dirty overalls standing on the step behind her. When she reached the top and stepped aside to let him pass, he had simply disappeared. She was later shown old crew photographs and identified the man without hesitation. It was John Petter. Whether or not you believe any of it, Shaft Alley has become the epicenter of the Queen Mary's paranormal reputation, and it's rare to find a ghost tour of the ship that doesn't end, or begin, right there at door 13. If Shaft Alley is the most consistent haunted location on the Queen Mary, the old swimming pools may be the most reported. Both the first-class and cabin-class pools have been drained for decades and are generally closed to the public, though they're occasionally shown on specialized tours. The most famous resident spirit here is a little girl visitors and staff have nicknamed Jackie. Accounts describe hearing a child laughing, singing old-fashioned children's songs, or splashing in a pool that has had no water in it for years. Some witnesses describe seeing a small girl in an old-style bathing costume near the pool's edge, sometimes said to be carrying a teddy bear, occasionally reported inviting guests to play hide-and-seek in the old changing rooms. There are competing stories about her origin. Some accounts describe a young first-class passenger who drowned in the pool during the ship's operating years. Others simply describe her as one of many spirits who seem drawn to the space. Alongside her, witnesses have reported seeing an older woman in a wedding dress wandering the pool deck and multiple figures dressed in 1930s-style bathing suits, as though a pool party from 90 years ago never quite ended. Some psychic investigators who've toured the space have described the hallway leading to the pool's old dressing rooms as feeling like a kind of threshold, a place where activity seems to concentrate more than almost anywhere else on the ship. Whatever the explanation, it's one of the most requested stops on every serious paranormal tour the Queen Mary offers. And then there's the room. The ship itself doesn't try to hide. Stateroom B340 sits on B deck in what was originally third class, or tourist class, territory. During the ship's active service, the deck held modest cabins, a children's playroom, a cinema, and a small synagogue, shared uneasily with the barbershops and beauty parlors also serving first and second class passengers one deck away. What exactly happened in that room over the decades depends on who's telling the story, and it's worth being upfront. This is the most heavily embellished corner of the whole legend, mixed with a fair amount of marketing. One frequently repeated tale describes a violent crime committed by a passenger during one of the ship's final transatlantic crossings in the 1960s, a story that's been told and retold with different, gorier details each time, which is usually a sign you're dealing with legend more than fact. What is documented is that a passenger named Walter Adamson died in that room in 1948 under circumstances that were never fully recorded, and reports of unusual activity in the room reportedly began not long after. When the ship was permanently docked in Long Beach, 3 small third-class cabins, including the one where Adamson died, were merged into a single, larger guest room, B340. Almost immediately, guests staying there began reporting strange experiences. The most common complaints, recorded again and again in the ship's own logs over the decades: sudden knocking on the door in the middle of the night with no one outside, bathroom lights switching on by themselves, faucets turning on and off unassisted, and closet or bathroom doors slamming shut on their own. Several guests have described waking up to find their blankets pulled completely off the bed, and more than one has reported opening their eyes to see a dark, motionless figure standing at the foot of the bed before it simply isn't there anymore. The activity became so persistent that the Queen Mary eventually stopped renting the room out entirely for roughly 30 years. When it finally reopened to overnight guests in 2018, it came fully leaning into its reputation. A supplied chest with a Ouija board, tarot cards, and a crystal ball, and current guests are encouraged to write their own experiences directly on the walls, joining the accounts left by decades of visitors before them. Time magazine has named it one of the 10 most haunted places on Earth, and reservations for a night in B340 regularly sell out around Halloween. Petter, Jackie, and the presence in B340 are the ship's headline acts, but paranormal investigators who've spent serious time aboard the Queen Mary claim the full number of spirits associated with the ship runs well over 100, some tied to specific, documented deaths, others to nothing more than a persistent feeling reported by enough different people over enough different years to become part of the legend. The old boiler room, deep and stiflingly hot even now, has produced reports of disembodied breathing and low voices. The former ship's nursery has generated reports of a baby crying, though no child has ever been found. Along the Grand Promenade deck, visitors describe shadowy figures walking alongside them in period-appropriate dress, vanishing the instant they're looked at directly. Is any of it real? That's ultimately for you to decide. Skeptics point out, correctly, that a ship this old, this large, and this cold naturally produces strange sounds: metal contracting and expanding, water moving through old pipes, drafts finding their way through a century-old structure. Add decades of ghost tours, a financial incentive to keep the legend alive, and the simple psychology of walking through a dark, unfamiliar space expecting to be scared, and you have a near-perfect recipe for a haunted reputation, with or without anything supernatural actually present. But what makes the Queen Mary different from your average haunted house is that the deaths behind these stories aren't folklore. They're documented. Real names, real inquiries, real dates in naval and coroner's records. Whatever you believe about what happens after that, it's hard to walk through Shaft Alley or stand at the door of B340 and not feel the weight of everything this ship has actually witnessed. From the height of transatlantic glamour to a wartime troop carrier responsible for one of the worst naval collisions of World War II, to a permanently moored hotel where guests pay a premium to spend the night with the lights off. The Queen Mary has lived more lives than almost any vessel in history. Maybe that's exactly why so many people believe part of her never really came to rest. If you ever find yourself in Long Beach, the ship offers ghost tours, and yes, you can book a night in stateroom B340 yourself if you're brave enough. If you enjoyed this deep dive, let me know in the comments whether you'd actually spend a night in B340, and subscribe for more stories from history's most haunted places.